just means less freedom for us. You gotta get this through your head. They're taking away our freedom. They're dividing us through this mainstream narrative, and then they're conquering us. And who are they? That's what I want you to research and educate yourself. Who's behind the curtain with these big banks? Who's behind the curtain with these big banks? The elite minority. Look into the families behind this. Look into the history.
Have you ever had the feeling that everything you thought you knew is a lie? Everything from history, science, government, banking, money, law, economics, farming, energy production, water treatment, healthcare, even spirituality.
And who are they? Who's behind the curtain with these big banks? The elite minority. Look into the families behind this. Look into the history.
Beneficial information in all these areas has been suppressed and revised in order to keep us enslaved and dependent upon a corrupt debt-based system we can never pay off.
The brainwashing that you are suffering from now, this media propaganda, it's just taking over everybody's psyche, basically. And this is exactly what the system wants. This is exactly what they want. And who are they? Who's behind the curtain with these big banks?
This is June 16th, 2020. Today, and in the last week or so, certain quarters of the internet have been freaking out at the extent to which vegan impresario and self-styled diet guru Freelee the Banana Girl has revealed herself to be right-wing, if not racist, if not anti-Semitic. In the first 20 minutes of her new video, she uses quite a lot of coded language, what you might call right-wing dog whistling, what you might call alt-right watchwords, indicating the extent to which she's not merely someone who participates in the internet subculture of conspiracy theories, blaming the government for obesity, blaming the government for people's addiction to meat and cheese, blaming the government for modern medical science, blaming the government and mass media advertising for why people believe they need to use shampoo. Anyone remember that? Anyone remember when she had a political crusade against shampoo? No? She's someone who has participated in, and she has been, shall we say, brainwashed by a great many fad conspiracy theories on the internet. So it's not completely surprising to learn that her view of the world has also been warped by some right-wing, racist, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the world. Before I go into this any deeper, I just want to say, this sort of topic, it's shallow and it's deep at the same time. It's fake and it's real at the same damn time. All of this may seem like a joke to you, but keep in mind there will be at least a few people in the audience for whom this is their first time really thinking seriously about these issues, and it's going to be a turning point. I get email from people like this all the time where they really start to reconsider what it is they've taken on faith from personalities in the internet whom they treated as experts, or at least treated as honest voices in an ongoing political discourse without doing any fact-checking. And you probably established that relationship of trust with the broadcaster just because they had a pretty face or a best-selling diet book, or they danced in an appealing way on TikTok or whatever it is that's going on these days. I get fan mail telling people about the way in which I've changed their lives, sometimes in some of my shallowest and stupidest videos, because that's what it took to provoke them to really reconsider certain assumptions in their lives. And of course, I get fan mail from people saying that I profoundly changed their lives in some of my videos that are more overtly and self-evidently profound in nature. But hey guys, all the time, the shallow is the body of the profound. Investigating something fake, the very fakeness turns out to be a container that conceals something real, something really worth investigating, really worth reflecting on. And this case of Freelee's right-wing and racist tendencies is no different. In the first 20 minutes of her video, 20 minutes that many people skipped over because she verbally prompts the audience to skip over. She says, hey, you might want to skip ahead to the 20-minute mark if you just want to hear what Freelee has to say against Black Lives Matter, etc. So many people did that. In the first 20 minutes, what Freelee does is present to you in the audience her personal conviction that the whole of modern Western economics is a sham, is a conspiracy operated by a small number of families, shadowy figures, what she calls, quote, the minority elite, close quote. Shadowy figures who have been controlling the banking industry throughout its whole history. She presents her belief that money itself, fiat currency, as you and I know it, is a conspiracy.
I'm going to start this video off with a quote. Henry Ford once said, "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." The Federal Reserve was originally drafted as the Aldrich Bill, but when it came into Congress, they recognized Senator Aldrich's name and smelt a rat. The bankers needed better cover. They decided to send two millionaire friends to carry the bill to quell the suspicions of Congress and renamed it the Federal Reserve Act. Next, in a textbook lesson of deceit, the bankers set out to fool the American people through disinformation. In the newspapers of the day, the bankers screamed and protested against the new Federal Reserve Bill. It would ruin the banks, they exclaimed. The average person read the protesting articles of the bankers and thought to themselves, if the bankers hate it, it must be good. And then they ended up unknowingly supporting a Trojan horse. And with that, a small group had complete monopoly over the issuing and creation of American money. The central banking model from the Bank of England and the United States has now been put in all countries, and even consolidated power in parts of Europe as the European Central Bank, or ECB. This unites separate countries under one economic policy. The only places in the world that don't have central banks are North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. In 2000, this list suspiciously included Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. So in essence, it is the central banks that control our economy and the central and commercial banking system together that control all of our money. The difference is, central banks can create money at will, while commercial banks need loans to create money.
This somewhat bizarre view of the economy has three types of proponents: neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and small numbers of right-wing libertarians who may or may not be racist as individuals, but their worldview isn't necessarily racist. Small numbers of right-wing libertarians who want to go back to the gold standard and who argue passionately but not persuasively that somehow the economy of the United States of America was way better in the 1890s, and that even healthcare was better in the 1890s, before the federal government got involved. It's a general crackpot argument against government regulation of any kind, including an opposition to the government regulation of money. So Freelee could be an example of someone who has been drawn into conversations on Reddit, Facebook, the various, political sub-basements of the internet, where she gradually got accustomed to this conspiracy theory view of the economy of the world and came to regard it as more real than what you can read in the newspaper. As she says passionately and insistently many times, she believes that the mainstream media are controlled by this conspiracy. Or it could be that she does, to some extent, actively, intentionally, and knowingly participate in white supremacism, anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, or some kind of right-wing libertarian ideology. I would not put it past her. As someone who's now been watching and commenting on Freelee's politics for many years, including even her involvement with Thailand during the dictatorship there has never been any reason to think that Freelee is left-wing. The fact that she's the type of person who can convince herself that, like, shampoo is a government conspiracy, or that toothpaste is a government conspiracy, or that everything that's taught in, the colleges of dietetics and nutrition are the product of a government conspiracy, that kind of conspiratorial thinking is, kind of inevitably, electably, inherently right-wing. It tends to draw people over to the far right, not to the far left. And people who are now shocked and horrified by hearing Freelee talk against Black Lives Matter in this way Can you remember any kind of contrast from her political past? Can you remember her expressing sympathy for Australia's Indigenous people in Canada, the United States? Can you remember her expressing any interest in, say, the politics of Africa? Can you remember during her years of living in Thailand, part-time, if not full-time, she was in Thailand for many months of the year, all the time, can you remember her ever expressing any interest in the plight of the poor and the downtrodden, let alone ethnic minorities, migrants, refugees? There were really many opportunities for Freelee to take some kind of moral or ethical stand on many, many different humanitarian and left-wing issues, and she never once has dipped a toe into any of those places. So yes, there always were grounds to suspect that she was a bit more right-wing than people presumed her to be, simply because she was vegan and propounded a vegan diet book. So my point is here, the conspiracy theory mindset and her attachment to some really wild and crazy conspiracy theories that are quite common among raw fruitarians. I mean, note also her hostility to vaccines and what have you, her overall blaming of everything in the world, everything wrong in the world. She already has the mentality of blaming on the mass media and the government conspiring together. So this next step of her blaming the bankers and what she repeatedly indicates to be just a few families who are behind the banking system, not entirely surprising. However, that argument, whenever you hear it on the internet, for example, from vegan John Rose, it's always anti-Semitic. What she's doing is playing a game of asking the audience to fill in the blanks, where she tells you, Google around, you'll figure out who I'm talking about. You'll figure out who the few families are who throughout the whole history of Europe have controlled the banks, who set up this whole system that she believes is some kind of conspiracy to impoverish people and make them chase debt and so-called fictional money their whole life. She says all this stuff. She uses all of the key terms that, again, either have to come from right-wing libertarian nutcases or, frankly, neo-Nazis. Nobody else engages in this discourse. And why? What ultimately is the point? People like Freelee, including these libertarians, they believe that the banking system was set up to conceal and exploit what she calls fictional money, creating money out of nothing. Now, this is fundamentally an error on her part. But where does it come from, this apprehension that what's fundamentally wrong with the banking system and the economy, leading to the conspiracy theory of the banks and the government controlling the mass media to brainwash you, blah, blah, blah? Where does all this come from? Imagine that you go to a store and you buy a bunch of groceries. And then, rather than paying in cash, the manager of the grocery store says to you, hey, do you want us to add that to your tab? This was much more common in the 1950s or 1960s. You've probably seen movies or sitcoms where somebody at a bar talks about paying their tab. It's disappeared from our culture in the 21st century, in part because paying with a credit card is so much easier. But there was a time when it was common for all kinds of businesses, including grocery stores, to run up a tab, to run up a bill for their customers, just using a pencil and piece of paper. They would write down how much money the customer owed the shop, and then maybe once a month or once every few months, the customer would settle the bill and pay the money outstanding. There's absolutely no reason to regard this as a conspiracy or as creating money out of nothing. But the misconception at the heart of this bizarre anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about banks controlling the world is actually this crude. It's fear and hostility towards the way in which debt, even debt that's created just by writing down on a piece of paper that you will pay me later, increases, in effect, the amount of money in circulation. So if you got paid by your job only $1,000 in a month and you were going to spend $200 on groceries, the fact that the manager of the store is willing to write down for you, they're willing to run a tab, they're willing to say, it's okay, you can come back and pay me later, that does mean that you still have more money in your pocket that you could go and spend elsewhere. Now, you do that at your own risk because sooner or later you have to pay back the grocery store manager. But nevertheless, there is in effect more money in circulation because of this form of debt, even if it's just debt created with a pencil and paper. Millions of people using millions of credit cards and millions of bank accounts do in this way multiply over and over again the amount of money being spent, the amount of money being saved, and some of that money exists in the form of debt. What people like Freelee are propounding, what she says directly, and in the video she uses short clips from, is that somehow money being exchanged with debt creates some sort of mass social hypnosis that enslaves people into working their whole lives, and otherwise, if it wasn't for this vast conspiracy of banks and debt and credit cards and what have you, that somehow everyone would have plenty of wealth, poverty wouldn't exist in the world, all poverty, all want, all hunger is just the product of this evil conspiracy that a few families, a minority elite, are benefiting from. And she then says, you go ahead and Google it. Don't trust the mainstream media. Don't trust mainstream social media. You Google around and figure out who it is she's talking about. Again, a neo-Nazi like John Rose plays exactly the same game.
That sick group of people, the powers that be, who control the media. It's obvious. Governments lie. The official version can't be trusted. History books are bunk. Look what Henry Ford did. He spent $5 million of the money, sacrificed his life, sacrificed a lot of money. He lost a lot of business by spending that $5 million over a 7-year period of time. You know what he did? He bought a newspaper, refused to take any advertising. He lost money on it. Now, Henry Ford was a rich man. He was the richest guy back then, industrialist. He was a good man, kind-hearted man. He was a vegetarian. He doubled his workers' wages overnight, paid the guy who got the least more money than his competitors paid the most. Gave him a pension plan. He donated $12 million the first year on behalf of those. And when he found out the powers that be and who they were, what did he do?
There may be a few of you in the audience who are so jejune as to object and say, no. What Freelee's saying is just a reasonable theoretical approach to explaining poverty on planet Earth. If so, ask yourself a few very simple questions. Cambodia, under communism, why was it poor? Poverty in Cambodia during communism, after communism, during the war, after the war, cannot be explained as the product of a banker's conspiracy to hypnotize people into living their lives with credit cards, a whole economy defined by debt. None of this makes sense. South Korea, after the end of World War II, was that also the result of this vast conspiracy involving the mainstream media, the banks, etc., etc.? How about, 50% of the continent of Africa, pretty much in any period of time in history? How about the Dark Ages in Europe? How about the vast majority of the United States of America, even in the 17th century or what have you? Most of the world has been poor for most of its history under all kinds of various conditions. The mystery is explaining why any society at any given time is not living in poverty. Poverty itself does not require a conspiracy theory to explain. Now, you can also flip this around and ask about a modern decadent society like Australia in the 21st century. If you took away everyone's credit cards, would they become richer or poorer? Would they have more money to spend or less? If you took away the ability of people to go into debt to buy a house, would that help them or hinder them? How is it that eliminating the debt economy, eliminating what's now the normal role of banks and bankers, how is it that that would help the poor rather than hinder them? Now, it's a coincidence that this involves African Americans, but we have a really telling historical example in the history of the United States of America. Almost any and every social scientist who's looked at the question of why blacks are poorer than white people in the United States today points to the fact that white people had better access to debt. The fact that white people could get bank loans to open a small business, the fact that white people could get a mortgage to buy a house to go into debt, even in the early days of credit cards, the fact that white people had credit cards first before black people did. If you had a white person and a black person who both had a job at a factory in the 1930s, and if they both were paid exactly the same amount, leaving aside the question of whether blacks were paid less, if you had a black person and a white person between 1935 and 1965, say, they worked the same factory job every day and they earned exactly the same amount of money. Nevertheless, the white person was in effect wealthier because that white person had the ability to spend more money going into debt. The same kind of multiplier I explained earlier. If you can just go to the grocery store and buy groceries without paying for it, run up a tab and pay later, you have in effect more money. Well, yeah, there are much more profound and important forms of debt than that. Like, hey, I don't want to work in this factory anymore. I want to open a barber shop. Can I go to a bank and get a bank loan? Or even can I just run up debt on a credit card? So between my savings and the credit card, I can start running this barber shop. And then when I retire from working at the factory, I own a barber shop. I have another source of income. That's where wealth comes from. A large part of the generation of wealth involves debt. And by depriving black people of access to debt, giving them far fewer options, it was much harder for them to buy a house, open a business, etc. Black people were disadvantaged for generations and generations, right? Freelee the Banana Girl's theory is voiced on the internet by many crackpots, and not all of them are racist. But people, even with the best of intentions, become part of one of these internet conspiracy subcultures without even realizing that's what they're doing. They start to regard really extreme and easily falsifiable claims, for example, from anti-vaxxers, people who are against vaccines. They start to regard those as scientific truth, and then when they're confronted with real scientific facts, they dismiss that as being a product of the media being controlled by a conspiracy, right? That's how anti-vaxxers think. Well, something similar happened with Freelee the Banana Girl, who convinced herself about a whole lot of really extreme and wacky health claims. And then whenever she saw scientific facts or reports in newspapers that contradicted those health claims, oh, well, the contradictory evidence is produced by a conspiracy that's trying to keep us down. It's not surprising she took another step into madness, understanding economics and politics in terms of this vast conspiracy that is at all times trying to suppress her view of the world. In conclusion, if you were to ask me straight up, is Freelee anti-Semitic? My answer is yes.